let's get right into it. The reason that you do not see Black history in Buddhism because it was a racist plan. Now, my lecture today is Science Dispels SGI Buddhist leader Daisaku Ikeda's racist teachings. Not only does science dispels the racism from the SGI, but science also dispels the racism that Nichiren Shoshu teach, Nichiren Shu teach, and what many white people teach. Science dispels their racist teachings. And this is what my lecture is about. Now, can you imagine? You have an African American, Anthony Elmore, that lives in Memphis, Tennessee, a brother that didn't graduate college, but a brother who challenges the institutional racism as it is taught in Japan, as it is taught by many white people who want to extricate all Black history from Buddhism, who want to remove Black people from Buddhism, who wants to take the history of Buddhism and make it a white Buddhism. Now, that was Malcolm X, who was a pimp, a hustler, but he came out to be one of the greatest African American leaders in our history because Malcolm X stood up for freedom, justice, and equality. And this is what Anthony Elmore does, and this is what I'm doing today in this lecture, that I'm showing you based on scientific evidence how the SGI, Nichiren Shoshu, and Nichiren Shu all use racism in their propagation of Buddhism, and we're going to get this straight. Now, I want you to look at my boy. And my boy is my partner. He used to be my partner anyway. His name is Shaka Julius. Now, let me tell you something about Shaka. Shaka went from an airline worker to being over-the-road truck driver. In fact, I introduced Shaka to Buddhism in 1983. I taught this brother how to be a kickboxer, and he became rated the number 5th rated kickboxer in the world. I was the world champion, and I taught Shaka. Shaka and I went to Australia together. When my movie premiered in Kenya, Shaka and I went to Kenya together. We went over the world. We were homies. We were brothers. When the brother didn't have no place to stay, 3 times in his life, I let this brother live with me. Now, back in, I guess, around 2012, somewhere thereof, Shaka decided that he was going to leave Nichiren Shoshu, and Shaka joined Nichiren Shu. And of course, I've had issues with SGI, and so I decided, let me check out what my boy Shaka has learned. And we went to Shaka's house to learn this Buddhism, and Shaka was a Nichiren Shu Buddhist. And he learned Buddhism from this sister, an African American sister by the name of Muke Shonin. Now, Muke Shonin's daddy was Black, her mama was Japanese, and she became the first African American priest, female priest in America. They did a story on this sister, See It in America, See It in Black in America. And we were very proud of Muke Shonin. But let me tell you something. When I told Shaka, I said, let's get together and let's call this thing Memphis Proud Black Buddhist. Boy, this woman raised hell and said, you can't do nothing like this. To make a long story short, my boy Shaka told me I was no longer welcome in his house because, see, I wrote Nichiren Shu leaders and I wrote Muke Shonin to tell her or to ask her what is their policy regarding African Americans. What is the Nichiren Shu policy in regards to history, in regards to culture, in regards to science? Are we to sit back and discard history, or are we going to be open-minded people who can teach truth, justice, and equality? And of course, it ended up that my boy Shaka told me I was no longer welcome in his house. Here's a brother that when he had his truck line, I loaned his brother $10,000 to get his own independent truck because I was a brother and I was a friend. It makes you wonder, what is it that makes a Muke Shonin who only has a bald head and a robe, what makes her so powerful in terms of the thinking? What kind of culture is it that these people in Nichiren Shu have, or Nichiren Shoshu have, that make people neglect science, make people neglect history? But let's get back into our lecture. Now, our lecture today, again, is Science Dispels SGI Buddhist leader Daisaku Ikeda racist teachings. It dispels the teachings of all these guys. Now, I want you to understand something so we can understand how science dispels the racism that all these sects and they dispel all of the racism that's in Buddhism. Now, let's begin, and I want to ask you a question. Do you believe like a man, like the high priest of Nichiren Shoshu, who is only a man? Do you believe Daisaku Ikeda, or do you believe an institution like the Risho University? They all write this erroneous information about Buddhism. They all extricate all black history from Buddhism. Do you believe them, or do you believe science? Now, at Harvard University, now, in a recent paper published in the American Journal of Human Genetics, researchers from Harvard, MIT, that's Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and the Center for Cellular Molecular Biology in Hyderabad assembled what they call the most comprehensive sampling of Indian genetic variation to date, using samples collected from 571 individuals belonging to 73 well-defined ethno-linguistic groups. They were able to come up with the greatest scientific finding ever in India, in that what they found through genetic research or molecular biology was that the caste system did not start in India until 1900 years ago. In other words, in common everyday sense, the caste system did not start in India until AD, after the death of Christ, or over 5 or maybe 600 years after the death of the Buddha. But yet when you look at the SGI, you look at Nichiren Shoshu, you look at Nichiren Shu, and they got this lie, they got this story on their teachings that there was an Aryan invasion, there was an Indo-Aryan culture. There was no Indo-Aryan culture in ancient India. There was no white people who came in and invaded India and who subordinated the people to the caste system. It did not happen to India until 500 or 600 years after the death of the Buddha. And all these people teach a racist Buddhism because they all got their history wrong, but science tells the real story. Now, in common everyday knowledge, molecular biology is an exact science, whereas we can know and understand things based on universal laws and principles. Who do you listen to? Are we to rate the words of Daisaku Ikeda, over the scientists at Harvard, MIT, and the top university in India? Do we take the words of Nichiren Shoshu, high priest, over science? Does my friend Shaka Julius take the words of Muke Shonin because she wears a robe? Adam Phillips, you my buddy, you my partner, I call you a Buddhist scholar. Do you take the words of the high priest of Nichiren Shoshu over Harvard or MIT? I understand that so many SGI members believe Daisaku Ikeda is a living Buddha, but what Daisaku Ikeda writes in the book, The Living Buddha, goes against absolute findings of science. Absolute findings of science. What Daisaku Ikeda writes is wrong. Now, I don't really have time to deal with a lot of nonsense, and really this next statement don't even warrant my time, but however, I want to put a Negro in his place. Now, there is a Negro by the name of Arthur Vidado. I guess that's how you pronounce it. Arthur Vidado lives in California. He's 66 years old, and he's always on the website fat-mouthing, talking a bunch of nonsense. Now, this is what this brother wrote me, and I just use this to show you about an ignorant Negro. He says, today is April 22nd, 2015. You are a fraud. And for Elmore, Shakyamuni being black, identifying Nichiren with the Chandela is irrefutable. There is too much written proof. You teach that Sanskrit is racist. The Lotus Sutra was interpreted from Sanskrit. You said Nichiren did not accept some Sanskrit sutras. You have been proven to be lying. Now, Arthur Vidado and all you ignorant Negroes, K-N-E-E, Negroes, all you ignorant Negroes, let's get one thing straight. All the white racists who is around here talking about some Sanskrit being some sacred language, talk about we praise Sanskrit, all I want all of y'all to do is shut me up. All you have to do is produce one single archaeological writing, a showing of Sanskrit prior to AD, prior to the Christian era. There is no Sanskrit written anywhere. There's no documentation, there's no archaeological, anthropological, literary evidence of any Sanskrit ever until AD. Show me any scientific, show me any Sanskrit, and I'll shut up. You know what, Arthur Vidado? Put it in your mouth, put it up. Show me a scientific evidence of any Sanskrit, because it did not exist, because Sanskrit is a fake, artificial language that was synthesized by Panini in the Shaka era or in AD. It did not exist, sir. You don't study, you get your teachings from racist white folk, and the racist white folk have come up with this Sanskrit nonsense, sacred language BS of an Aryan invasion that never happened. Now, let us start with Daisaku Ikeda. Daisaku Ikeda wrote a book. It's called The Living Buddha. And this is what Daisaku Ikeda writes in the book. He says, quote, "Finally, I do not think that it is possible to determine for certain the racial origin of Shakyamuni, who lived many centuries ago. It cannot be denied, however, that in the ways of thinking associated with Buddhism, there are characteristics that strongly suggest some connection to Indo-Aryan peoples and their culture. Whatever the racial origin of its founder, there is no doubt that Buddhism grew up within the Indo-Aryan cultural spirit. Ho-ho! Daisaku Ikeda, you are lying. Didn't know Buddhism grew up in no Indo-Aryan cultural sphere, because during the time of the Buddha, there was no Indo-Aryan cultural sphere. There's no scientific, archaeological, literary evidence of any Indo-Aryan culture during the time of the Buddha. Let us use absolute science to dispel what Daisaku Ikeda writes. In Nepal, where the Buddha was born, and in India, molecular biology based on genetics tell us about the people of ancient India. Science proves Daisaku Ikeda wrong in that there were no Indo-Aryan people or an Indo-Aryan culture during the time of the Buddha. DNA tells us exactly when the Indo-Aryan culture emerged in India. 5,000 years ago, the ancestors of modern Indians were comprised primarily of two groups: ancestral North Indians, who related to the people in Central Asia, the Middle East, the Caucasus, and Europe, and ancestral South Indians, who are closely related to the group outside the subcontinent. The mixture between the two groups, and there are many subcategories, happened mostly between 4,200 and 1,900 years ago, according to the study. The authors note that the period is significant as it was a time of profound change in India, characterized by the de-urbanization of the Indus civilization, increasing population density in central and downstream portions of the genetic system, the cultural and burial practices of the Indo-Aryan culture of the Vedic culture did not happen in India until 1,900 years ago. That would put us about, the first century, AD 100 or 200 years after the death of Christ. Until that time, there were no Aryans, or there were no white people in charge in India. What they did, ladies and gentlemen, they rewrote history. They changed Buddhism from black to white. India changed from black to white. This study by Harvard and MIT and the top universities in the world, understanding molecular biological study, the study of genetics, shows when this actually happened, when the shift in culture came. Prior to that, Buddhism in India was a black nation dominated, and the black kings of India allowed cultural integration. It was only when the Indo-Europeans got into power in India, you had a cultural shift, and you see how Buddhism changed from black to white. Let's give you some historical facts. Now, the first landmark in India's political history is the emergence of the kingdom of Magadha. The Buddha was born in Magadha, in that area, in Bihar, in 642 BC. The founder of the kingdom of Magadha is a king by the name of Sisu Naga. Sisu Naga belongs to the indigenous Indian group in India. They were black people. From the small beginnings made by Sisu Naga, this kingdom of Magadha grew in its extent under the capable rulers of this Sinsugata dynasty. The country of Kusala came under the sway of Magadha. The Magadha kingdom grew into an empire under the rule of Bimbisara. King Bimbisara was a patron of Shakyamuni Buddha, and his son Ajasutra was influenced by Devadatta, who was the cousin of the Buddha, and all of them were black. At this time, there was no Indo-Aryan culture. They were black people. They were dark people. They were not white people. There's no evidence of such. At this time, there was no such thing as Sanskrit language. Now, under the rule of King Bimbisara came the great Magadha Empire. Now, the Sansu dynasty continued to rule the kingdom till 413 BC. In this year, the reigning emperor of the Sansu dynasty was Mahananda, and he was killed by Nanda. Now, if you want to know about the Nanda dynasty was the black empire that Alexander the Great tried to conquer. Alexander the Great tried to bring his butt up through the Hindu Kush pathway. And he was met by a whole bunch of elephants, and these black dudes stopped Alexander the Great. There was no Indo-Aryan culture at this time. Alexander the Great got stopped. Now, when Alexander the Great got stopped, he did conquer the path, what they call the Hindu Kush, which later became Afghanistan, which his generals later took over, and they were later converted to Buddhism. But let's keep going. Now, the Nanda dynasty ruled over the Empire of Magadha up to 322 BC. Now, people who you know like Zarathustra, who actually the Buddha helped and saved, who helped continue the Buddhist teachings after the Buddha died. Now, the bottom line is Magadha Empire were black people. There was no such thing in Magadha as Vedic culture or Sanskrit writing art of Adado or Bobby Hudson. There were no Aryans running nothing in India during the reign of the black or Naga kings. When you study the Gohonzon, there are Naga kings on the Gohonzon, and the Nagas were the black people that lived in Magadha, that lived in India. Now, you know about Bimbisara, the son of Chandragupta. He assumed the throne in 298 BC. His son, King Asoka, a black king, came into power in 273 BC. Asoka the Great left edicts all over the world. He left edicts all over the world, ladies and gentlemen, and he wrote the edicts in a language that we all understand. It was not no Sanskrit. He left the edicts in a language called Karasi script. We showed you in other lectures the Apphodimak Temple in Naga, Sudan. In Sudan, because black people practiced Buddhism 1,000 years before Buddhism ever got to Japan. Buddhism was in the African country, Ethiopia. It was in Ethiopia, it was in Egypt, and it was in Nubia. It was in Africa. Because the Buddhists were African people, they were black people, but he also, King Asoka, was able to introduce Buddhism around the world, and he left it in writing, and he left edicts. Now, this guy, Mr. Arthur Fadado, listen, Negro. Listen, Negro. Neegrow. Listen, Negro. Now, show me one single evidence, any archaeological evidence of Sanskrit prior to AD. Prior to the Christian era, there was no Sanskrit language because Sanskrit language was invented by a Brahmin by the name of Panini. And it didn't happen until the Shaka era, or didn't happen until AD, because no Sanskrit was invented. No white man, no Indian, no Japanese, nobody can produce one single evidence of Sanskrit, because they got archaeological evidence. Was the Rudam Danam. That is the first Sanskrit writing. That's the oldest archaeological evidence of Sanskrit. Other than that, did no Sanskrit exist. Now, this would happen if you want to know the history. In 184 BC, the ruler of Magadha, he was a black general, black emperor by the name of Brihadarata. He was killed in broad daylight by Pushyamitra. The Brahmin commander Pushyamitra became the ruler of India. He was a Brahmin. He put a bounty of 100 pieces of gold on the head of every Buddhist monk. His aim was to destroy Buddhism and make the Brahmin Buddhism the state religion. When he killed the Brahmin king, he was only able to control northern India, because southern India was black India, and he got into power and he put the Brahmins in power. Now, the founder of Panini, he was a contemporary of Pushyamitra. This is where Sanskrit was synthesized from Sanskrit. Sanskrit was an artificial language created by Panini. This was a racist language. Pushyamitra, who killed the Maurya king, was able to rule northern India. Now, in 29 BC, in Sri Lanka, it was Ceylon at the time, it was not called Sri Lanka. Buddhism was put into writing. It was called the Pali Canon, or this is where Theravada Buddhism emerged. And it was put in the black language of Pali, or Sanskrit, or Karasi. It was a black language. There was no such thing as no Vedic culture at the time. The world's largest religious text in the world is written in Sanskrit, the language of black people in India. Now we move 100 years later to the Kushan dynasty. Now when we move into the Kushan dynasty, we got the king Kanishka of the Kushan dynasty. Now, in 78 AD, he called what his own Fourth Buddhist Council. And what he did and what the Kushan general did. Now, understand, ladies and gentlemen, that when Buddhism got to Afghanistan and you saw the Taliban shoot them big Buddha statues down in Afghanistan, well, that's the Kushan dynasty. And the king Kanishka. See, when Alexander the Great tried to conquer India, his generals moved into Afghanistan and they adopted Buddhism because of King Asoka. So Buddhism was around for a few hundred years in Afghanistan and they were Buddhists. Now, this king who was related to the Greek people or who was Indo-Aryan, he joined in with the Buddhists. He joined in with the new Buddhists. There was a new set of Buddhists who had emerged out of India and he supported them. They came in with a brand new Buddhism. They came in with a brand new language. And what they invented was a Buddhism called Mahayana Buddhism. Mahayana Buddhism was related to the Sanskrit language. So they came in with Mahayana Buddhism, they came in with Sanskrit language, and then they titled Buddhism. They called it Hinayana Buddhism, which means lower vehicle, which was a racist or a derogatory name. Nichiren Shonin in the Go Show does not make that much a distinction between Hinayana and Mahayana Buddhism. Nichiren Shonin did not. But what this King Kanishka did, what he did was for the first time in the history of Buddhism, they divided Buddhism up in terms of ethnic, that means through race, through culture, and through language, through linguistic. What they did was King Kanishka called his own fourth Buddhist council and they started to put the Buddhist writings into Sanskrit. What they did was they changed Buddhism from black to white. They changed the language of Buddhism. That's when the spirit of Buddhism changed. And that's when the emergence of Sanskrit happened. Now, we go up to the time of 320 AD. In 320 AD, ladies and gentlemen, this is the time of the Hindu king Chandragupta Vikramaditya. Again, Chandragupta Vikramaditya. This is the king of the Gupta era who created the golden period of Hinduism. It is called the golden period of Hinduism is because this Hindu king made Sanskrit the official language. They got rid of the black language and they made the official language of India Sanskrit. They got rid of Theravada Buddhism and they became the Mahayanas. So this is the time where Buddhism changed from black to white. Now, how do we know that there was no Sanskrit language at the time of the Buddha? It is clear that Sanskrit is Indo-Aryan. During the time of the Buddha, there were black kings and integration of people. There was no such thing as a caste system. The scientists at Harvard and MIT shows us that the caste system is only 1900 years old, or about the time of the Hindu king. Now, that is only about the time of the Hindu king who made Hindu or who made the Sanskrit the official language. The caste system happened just as Sanskrit and the racist caste system was invented that made people with black skin lower than slaves. because the caste system was worse, because this is the time in history when they created what is known as the Chandalas. Nichiren Shonin says, I, Nichiren, am from the family of a Chandala. He says this in the Gosho, letter from Sado and banishment to Sado. Nichiren says he's from the family of the Chandalas. The Chandalas were the untouchable people, because what the Indo-Aryans did to the people, they made the people who were ancestors of the Buddhists, they said, you can't even be in a caste. You're going to be untouchable. You are going to be polluted people. Now, what these people tell you is that they tell you a lie. They don't tell you the true history. Now, but what has happened is that science, ladies and gentlemen, has come up, because one writer says, truth crushed the earth shall rise again. Now, the Pali language is Paraskip, and this is what the Buddha spoke. Now, this is what happened recently. They found the language in these tubs, these marble tubs or whatever they kept, and they found the writings of Karate. It says what? It says manuscripts prove that early Buddhist writing came from Praskrit, not Sanskrit. It says the discovery of substantial corpus of Buddhist manuscripts in Gohari language supports the Gohari hypothesis proposed by Ernest Wamscott, John Burrow, and other scholars. According to this theory, at least some of the earliest Chinese translations of Buddhist texts were prepared from the originals, not Sanskrit, as previously assumed, but rather in Gohari. Since the existence of such a body of Gohari literature is now a matter of fact rather than hypothesis, there is good reason to believe that the newly discovered manuscripts are closely related to the archetypes of the earliest Buddhist texts in Chinese. Thus, these new discoveries constitute a missing link between Buddhism and its Indian homeland and its later manifestations. In other words, what is 100% clear, in fact, that the Buddha Shakyamuni did not speak Sanskrit. It is also clear that Kumajiva, the Taivatika master, did not translate the Lotus Sutra in Chinese language from Sanskrit. Now, why does the SGI, Nichiren Shoshu, Nichiren Shu all teach that the Buddha spoke Sanskrit? There at the time, now listen very carefully, ladies and gentlemen, at the time that Kumajiva translated the Lotus Sutra from the Indian language to Chinese, there were no Sanskrit versions at the time. They cannot find any Sanskrit version of the Lotus Sutra at the time when Kumajiva translated the Lotus Sutra from the Indian language of Praskrit to Chinese, because Sanskrit versions did not exist. Somebody show me, please talk to me, show me an archaeological literary evidence of such things, because it did not exist. Now, Sanskrit is the language used in India to promote the caste system. The fact is, dark people or untouchable people were not even allowed to hear Sanskrit. The law was that if a Chandala or an untouchable hear the sacred Sanskrit, what they call sacred, or the racist language, melted iron was to be poured in his ears. Sanskrit was used to promote race. It was a race distinction. That's why they used Sanskrit, because they got rid of the Pali language. They got rid of the black language, and they created white Buddhism. It was Adolf Hitler who praised Sanskrit. It was Adolf Hitler and the so-called Aryans that embraced the racist concepts of caste as promoted in India. Now, let us go to the latest translation. Even the SGI paid Burton Watson to translate the Lotus Sutra. Now, the translation note of Burton Watson, in the translator's note, it reads, why one may also ask if the Lotus Sutra is a work of Indian Buddhism. Has the translation been made from the Kumajiva's Chinese translations of the text rather than one from Sanskrit versions? First, as already mentioned, my introduction, though we do not know what language the Lotus Sutra was first composed in, it was clearly not Sanskrit. Therefore, the Sanskrit versions of the text are already several steps removed from the written form, unquote. Burton Watson also says, Buddhism died out in India long ago, and the Sanskrit versions of the text were lost for many hundreds of years, only coming to the light again in recent times. Today, no one but a handful of scholars read the Lotus Sutra in Sanskrit versions, whereas Kumajiva's text is read and recited daily by millions of priests and lay believers in East Asia. It is the language and imaginary of Chinese Lotus Sutra that has molded the religious life and thought of the peoples of that part of the world and made its way into art and literature. So it seems wholly justifiable to make the English translation from the still and living and vital version of the scripture. Molecular biology dispels the inaccurate Buddhist history that Japanese and whites teach. They have a problem acknowledging Black Buddhist history that chooses to live with a lie. There was no Sanskrit. There was no Aryan invasion. There was no Vedic culture. As SGI, Nichiren Shoshu and Nichiren Shoshu teach, there was no Vedic culture until 1900 years ago. Molecular biology, genetics prove it through science. All of them are a lie. I am Anthony M. Elmore. We are the best suited, and we are the proud Black Buddhists. Have a good day.
Something what is called the Vedic culture. The culture was a religion called Hinduism that created the world's first religious racism. That created a system called caste that made Black people eternally last. The Vedic religion was called Brahminism. It was the started teachings of ancient Buddhism. Let me let you in on some facts. The icons of the ancient Buddha were all black. Let me break down to you the Buddhist mystery. Shakyamuni Buddha was the first Buddha recorded in history.